Before you hear my story, I want you to do something for me. Go and find a box. It doesn't matter what kind. A shoebox, an old biscuit tin, a dusty carton in the attic. Open it. Look at what's inside. Maybe it's old photographs with curled edges. Maybe it's a handful of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Maybe it's just a broken watch or a single unmatched earring. Now ask yourself, is this junk? Is this clutter? Or is this proof? Proof that you loved, that you lived, that you were here. Keep that in mind, because my children, my own flesh and blood, they forgot the difference, and that single, simple mistake cost them everything. My name is Clara. I'm 68 years old, and for 45 of those years, I lived in a house on Chestnut Street. It wasn't a mansion, just a sturdy two-story brick house that my husband Arthur and I bought when our own children were barely walking. Over the decades, that house became more than just bricks and mortar. It became a library of our lives. Every scuff on the floorboards, every chipped teacup in the china cabinet, every book on the shelves held a memory. Arthur passed away 5 years ago, and since then the house had grown quieter. But to me it was never empty. He was in the scent of old paper that clung to his favorite armchair, in the weight of the quilt on our bed, in the quiet hum of the old refrigerator. My children, Ethan and Charlotte, never saw it that way. To them the house was a museum of what they called my old things. They'd visit on holidays, their eyes sweeping over the rooms with a kind of clinical pity. Ethan, a financial analyst who lived in a minimalist high-rise that looked like a hospital ward, would run his finger over a dusty mantelpiece and sigh. "Look at all this stuff, Mom. It's a fire hazard." Charlotte, who'd married a wealthy developer and curated her life for social media, would pick up a porcelain shepherdess my grandmother had brought from the old country and say, "This is cute, I guess. But it doesn't really go with anything, does it?" They saw clutter. I saw the story of us. They saw junk. I saw the physical evidence of a life well lived and a love deeply cherished. The fight, if you could call it that, had been brewing for years. It was a low-level campaign of attrition. They'd gift me subscriptions to magazines about downsizing. They'd email me links to sleek, soulless retirement communities. They'd talk about my safety and my mobility in hushed, concerned tones, as if I were already fading away. It wasn't about my well-being, it was about their discomfort. My world of memories and heirlooms was an untidy, inconvenient reproach to their clean, modern, forward-facing lives. The inciting incident, the moment the Cold War turned hot, was a weekend trip. My best friend, Margaret, had invited me to the coast for a few days to celebrate her 70th birthday. I was excited. It had been ages since I'd seen the ocean. I packed my bags, watered my plants, and left a note on the counter. Ethan and Charlotte had the keys, of course, for emergencies. I called them both before I left. "Have a wonderful time, Mom," Ethan had said, his voice distracted. "Don't you worry about a thing here. We'll keep an eye on the place." That was on a Friday. I remember the salty air, the sound of the gulls, the way Margaret and I laughed until our sides ached, reminiscing about our own youthful follies. It was a weekend of pure, uncomplicated joy. I returned on Sunday evening, feeling refreshed and lighter than I had in years. I pulled into my driveway, the familiar crunch of gravel under the tires a welcome sound. But as I walked toward the front door, a prickle of unease ran down my spine. The porch light, which I always left on, was off. A large white van was parked at the curb. I didn't recognize it. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, and my world stopped. The house was empty. Not completely empty, but hollowed out, gutted. The entryway table, where I kept a bowl for my keys and the mail, was gone. The living room, which had been filled with the comfortable mismatched furniture Arthur and I had collected over the years, now held only the largest sofa and a single side table, looking marooned and lonely in the vast space. The bookshelves were barren. The walls were naked, dotted with pale squares where pictures had hung for decades. My photo albums, my grandmother's china, the little wooden music box Arthur had given me on our first anniversary, all of it gone. A faint, sterile smell of lemon cleaner hung in the air, a chemical ghost trying to erase the scent of home. My heart hammered against my ribs. My first thought was that I'd been robbed. I stumbled through the dining room, into the kitchen, the same emptiness. The old spice rack Arthur had built was gone. The collection of colorful magnets on the refrigerator, souvenirs from every family vacation, had vanished. I felt a wave of nausea. I was about to call the police when I saw it, a crisp white envelope propped up against the sugar bowl on the kitchen counter. My name was written on it in Charlotte's perfect loopy handwriting. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tear it open. The note was brief and breathtakingly cheerful. It read, "Surprise, we know how overwhelmed you've been with all the clutter, so we decided to give you a little gift. We spent the whole weekend clearing things out to make the house safer and more manageable for you. Don't worry, we didn't throw anything away. It's all safely packed in a top-of-the-line climate-controlled storage unit. We even paid for the first 6 months. Now you have a clean slate to live your golden years without all that old stuff weighing you down. We'll call you tomorrow to tell you all about it. Love, Ethan and Charlotte." I read the note 3 times. The words swam before my eyes. A clean slate, old stuff, weighing you down. They hadn't just moved my furniture. They had curated my life. They had taken my memories, boxed them up, and put them in a tin can on the other side of town. They called it a gift. It felt like an amputation. The shock was so profound it was almost silent, a deep, internal implosion. I sank onto the floor, the cold tile, a stark contrast to the boiling rage and grief that began to flood my veins. They had taken decades of my life, my photo albums, my heirlooms, my late husband's letters, the very soul of my home, and locked it away. They thought they were decluttering my house for my own safety, but in their arrogant, thoughtless crusade, they had forgotten one crucial, tiny detail. In my house, hidden for over 30 years behind a loose brick in the fireplace, a brick they had probably vacuumed around and wiped down, was the only key to our family's safe deposit box. A box that held not only my own valuables, but the bearer bonds and property deeds that constituted their own very substantial trust funds. They thought they were clearing out my past. They had actually just locked themselves out of their entire future. And in that moment, sitting on the cold kitchen floor of my hollowed-out home, something inside me shifted. It wasn't about revenge, not at first. It was about survival. But oh, it would become about revenge. It most certainly would. The first 24 hours were a blur of cold, quiet fury. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a physical ache in my chest, a hollowness that echoed the emptiness of my home. I walked through the rooms like a ghost, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the bare wood floors. I touched the pale rectangles on the walls, where paintings and photographs used to hang, my fingers tracing the ghosts of frames. This was where the portrait of my parents on their wedding day had been. This was the spot for the clumsy, beautiful watercolor of a sailboat Ethan had made in 2nd grade. This was where Arthur and I had hung a framed map of the world, covered in pins marking all the places we had dreamed of visiting together. Gone. All of it. They called, just as the note promised. It was Charlotte first, her voice bright and chirpy, as if she'd just given me a spa day, instead of performing a non-consensual cultural revolution on my home. "So, what do you think? Isn't it amazing? You can breathe in there now." I couldn't speak. The words were lodged in my throat, a thick, bitter knot. "Mom, are you there?" she asked, a flicker of impatience in her tone. "I found your note," I said, my voice raspy, unfamiliar to my own ears. "Great, Ethan and I worked so hard. You have no idea how much dust was under everything. It was a serious health hazard. We found the storage unit receipt on the counter for you, by the way. Unit 3B. It's a great facility over on Industrial Way, where the city's forgotten things went to rust. How fitting. You moved Arthur's letters, I said, the statement flat, devoid of emotion. Of course we did. We packed them so carefully, Mom, in a special acid-free box and everything. They're safe, everything is safe. But they're not here, I whispered. That's the point, Charlotte said, her voice taking on that gentle, condescending tone she used when she thought I was being difficult. We wanted to give you a fresh start. All that old stuff, it's not healthy to live in the past. It's what Dad would have wanted. He'd want you to be safe and happy. That was the line that broke me. The sheer unadulterated audacity of her speaking for my husband, of using his memory as a weapon to justify this violation. Arthur loved this house. He loved our stuff. He used to say that a house without memories was just a box. He would have been horrified. The rage that had been simmering inside me finally boiled over, but it didn't come out as a shout. It came out as an unnerving, icy calm. You have no idea what your father would have wanted, Charlotte. Not the faintest clue. There was a pause. I had never used that tone with her before. Mom, you're being emotional, she said, falling back on her usual script. Just give it a few days, you'll see that we were right. It's for your own good. Ethan will call you later. He has to run to a meeting. The call ended. I stood in the silent kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear. For your own good. The three most dangerous words in the English language. They are the justification for every petty tyranny, every casual cruelty. Later that evening, I sat in Arthur's armchair, which they had mercifully left behind, probably because it was too big and heavy to move easily. I closed my eyes and let the memories come. Not the stolen ones, the ones they'd packed away, but the ones they couldn't touch, the ones stored inside me. I remembered Arthur on one knee in this very room, not with a ring, but with a hammer and a loose brick. We'd been married for about 10 years. Ethan was a toddler, and Charlotte was on the way. Arthur had just received a small but significant inheritance from his uncle, which included a portfolio of bearer bonds. It was old money, and Arthur had an old-world skepticism about banks and digital records. Clara, my love, he'd said, his eyes serious but with that familiar twinkle in them. These pieces of paper are flighty, they belong to whoever holds them. There's no name, no account number, just the paper itself. I don't want them in a bank where some clerk can make a mistake or some computer can glitch and erase them. I want them somewhere solid. He'd found a safe deposit box at the old First National downtown, a place with thick steel doors and attendants who had worked there for 50 years, but he didn't trust leaving the only key in a drawer. Anyone can find a key in a drawer, he'd reasoned. It needs a home nobody would think to look for, so he'd carefully loosened a single brick in the back of the fireplace, a spot that was always covered in a light layer of soot. He chiseled out a small cavity behind it, just big enough. He wrapped the long brass key in oilcloth and placed it inside. This is our secret, he'd told me, pressing the brick back into place. Our little bit of pirate treasure. The children will get their trusts when they're mature enough to understand that the value of something isn't just the number printed on it. Until then, the key stays with the heart of the home. The heart of the home. He meant me, and he meant the fireplace, the hearth. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. My children had dismantled the heart of the home, blind to the treasure hidden within it. The next day my best friend Margaret came over. She'd called to see how my trip was, and I'd broken down, the whole story tumbling out in a torrent of grief and anger. She walked in, took one look at the cavernous living room, and let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. Margaret was a retired librarian, a woman who believed that books and memories were sacred. She was my voice of reason, the external validation I so desperately needed. The little monsters, she said, her arms wrapped around me, the ungrateful, arrogant, little monsters. What in God's name were they thinking? They said it was for my own good. I mumbled into her shoulder. That's code for your life, is inconvenient for us, and you know it, she said. pulling back to look me in the eye. Her own children lived across the country, and she was in a constant low-grade battle with her nephew, who was her heir, and kept trying to get her to sell her collection of first-edition novels to fund his startup. He called them dusty old books. She understood. She sat me down in the armchair and made me a cup of tea in a mug they had overlooked. "So what are you going to do?" she asked, her tone shifting from comforting to practical. "I don't know," I confessed. "I feel erased." "Clara, listen to me." Arthur was a smart man. He was also a deeply cautious man. He never fully trusted Ethan's slickness or Charlotte's obsession with appearances. He loved them, but he wasn't blind. There's a reason he set things up the way he did. He trusted you. He trusted your judgment. What are they so desperate to get their hands on, anyway? "Their trust funds," I said, the words tasting like ash. "The bearer bonds and the deeds to a few investment properties he bought years ago. And how do they access those?" "With the key," I said, a slow, cold realization dawning on me. "The key to the safe deposit box." "And where is that key?" Margaret asked, a slow smile spreading across her face. My eyes drifted to the fireplace. "Oh, you beautiful man, Arthur," Margaret whispered, looking at the fireplace with newfound reverence. He knew. He must have known this day might come. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. But sitting there with Margaret, a different feeling began to take root in the desolate soil of my grief. It was a cold, hard seed of resolve. My children had treated me like an object, a piece of their past that needed to be tidied up and put away. They had judged my life, my memories, my love for their father, and found it all wanting. They had passed sentence and carried it out without a trial. They saw me as a relic, a feeble old woman who needed to be managed. Fine, let them think that. This feeble old woman was the only person on earth who knew where their future was buried. The seed of resolve began to sprout. It wasn't about lashing out. It was about taking back control. They had made their move on the chessboard, a reckless sweeping attack that left their king completely exposed. Now, it was my turn, and I was going to play a much, much quieter game. The first step was to see the battlefield. I drove to Industrial Way, a bleak landscape of concrete warehouses and chain-link fences. The storage facility was called Secure Space, a sterile modern building painted in a depressing shade of corporate beige. I walked into the office, the receipt Charlotte had so thoughtfully left for me clutched in my hand. A bored-looking young man sat behind the counter, scrolling on his phone. He barely looked up as he processed my paperwork and handed me a key card. "Unit 3B is on the second floor," he said, gesturing vaguely. Elevators at the end of the hall. The hallways were long and silent, lit by humming fluorescent lights. The air was cool and smelled faintly of dust and plastic. It was a mausoleum for possessions. I found Unit 3B and swiped the card. The heavy corrugated metal door rolled up with a loud clang that echoed in the silence. And there it was, my life. It was all there, stacked in a chaotic jumble of cardboard boxes. Some were new, crisp moving boxes. Others were my own old cartons, hastily sealed with fresh tape. Labels were scrawled in Charlotte's handwriting. Kitchen junk, living room knickknacks, Mom's old books. And one, in a box at the very back, sent a fresh spear of pain through me. Dad's office stuff. I stepped inside the 10 by 20-foot cage. I opened a box labeled photos. Inside, my family albums were just thrown in, their spines bent, their covers rubbing against each other. I picked one up. It was from our first trip to the Grand Canyon, a picture of a 5-year-old Ethan grinning, with a gap in his teeth, his hand held tightly in Arthur's. I traced his little face with my finger. This was clutter, this was old stuff. I spent 4 hours in that cold, silent room. I didn't move anything, I just looked. I cataloged. I took inventory of the sheer scale of their violation. They hadn't just packed things away. They had emptied drawers, swept entire shelves into boxes without care. I found my mother's wedding ring, which I kept in a small velvet box in my bedside table, loose in a carton with old batteries and stray buttons. I found Arthur's military service medals tangled up with a bunch of defunct charging cables. The carelessness was more insulting than malice would have been. It showed they hadn't even seen the items. They had just seen mass, volume, obstacles to be removed. It wasn't about preserving my memories as Charlotte had claimed. It was about speed, efficiency, getting the job done so they could get back to their own important lives. When I finally rolled the door down and left, the sun was setting. The seed of resolve had now become a hardy sapling. My grief was still there, a deep resonant ache, but it was now overlaid with a crystalline diamond-hard anger. This was not just an insult. It was a fundamental miscalculation on their part. They had assumed I was passive. They had assumed I was powerless. They had assumed that my love for them was unconditional, a blank check they could cash no matter how they treated me. They were wrong on all counts. My plan began to form, not as a grand, complex scheme, but as a series of small, quiet steps. The first thing I needed was information. My children saw me as technologically illiterate, a woman who could barely operate a television remote. In reality, I had been taking a community college class on digital literacy, something I'd never bothered to tell them. I spent the next week at the library, not the one Margaret used to run, but one on the other side of town. I researched bearer bonds. Arthur had been right. They were relics from a bygone era, unregistered, anonymous instruments. Possession was, quite literally, 10/10 of the law. Without the physical certificates, they were worthless. I researched trust law, using the library's legal databases. I learned about fiduciary duties and the conditions under which a trustee could be removed. The language was dense, but the core principles were clear. Arthur had set up their trust to be disbursed upon his death, but with a crucial handwritten codicil in his will, a will I had the only original copy of. The codicil stipulated that the assets of the trust held in the safe deposit box were to be accessed and managed by me, the executor, and distributed to them at my discretion, upon demonstration of sufficient maturity and respect for the family's legacy. Sufficient maturity and respect for the family's legacy. My dear, clever Arthur. It was a morality clause. A time bomb he had set 30 years ago, and my children had just cheerfully stomped on the trigger. My next step was to secure my flank. I needed a professional. Margaret gave me the name of a lawyer, a young woman named Amelia Davies. She's sharp as a tack and has no patience for entitled brats, Margaret had said. She helped my friend Helen with her husband's estate, and the family tried to pull all sorts of nonsense. Making that appointment was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. It felt like a betrayal, even though I was the one who had been betrayed. I sat in Miss Davies's modern, elegant office, clutching the original copy of Arthur's will and a photo I'd taken of the mess in the storage unit. I told her everything. The story poured out of me, this time not with tears, but with a cold, factual precision. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable. She read the will, paying close attention to the codicil. She looked at the photo of the storage unit, her lips tightening into a thin line. They called this a gift? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. And for my own good, I added. She leaned back in her chair. Mrs. Peterson, your children have not only committed a profound act of emotional cruelty, they have made a catastrophic legal error. The codicil your husband wrote is highly unusual, but it's ironclad. His language is precise. At the executor's discretion, upon demonstration of sufficient maturity, you hold all the cards, all of them. So what can I do? I asked. Legally, she said, a small dangerous smile playing on her lips. What do you want to do? You could, for instance, determine that their recent actions are a profound demonstration of immaturity and a complete lack of respect for the family's legacy. You could therefore at your discretion decide that the conditions for disbursement have not been met. You mean I can just not give it to them? You can certainly delay it indefinitely. The interpretation of sufficient maturity is left entirely up to you, the executor. They could challenge it in court, of course. But what would their argument be? Our mother won't give us our inheritance because we emptied her house of all her cherished possessions without her permission. What judge do you think would look favorably on that? Especially, she added, tapping the photo of the storage unit, with this as Exhibit A. We spent another hour talking. We discussed my own finances. Thankfully, Arthur and I had been prudent. My pension was solid, and I had my own savings and investments, completely separate from the children's trusts. I was not dependent on them for anything. Another fact they seemed to have conveniently forgotten. Miss Davies helped me draft a few documents, a new power of attorney, naming Margaret as my agent instead of Ethan, a new healthcare directive, and a new will, a very, very new will. In this version, my personal assets, the house, my savings, were not to be split between my children. Instead, they were to be placed in a charitable trust, established in Arthur's name, to fund arts and history programs for underprivileged youth. A portion was also set aside for Margaret, for her loyalty and friendship. Ethan and Charlotte were to receive $1 each. The legal language was cold and precise. It stated they were being disinherited not out of a lack of love, but due to actions they had taken which demonstrated a fundamental disconnect from the values their father and I had sought to instill in them. Walking out of that law office, I felt a strange sense of peace. The plan was no longer just a nebulous feeling of anger. It had structure. It had legal teeth. It was real. The final part of my preparation was personal. I went back to my house. I walked to the fireplace. My hands were steady now. I pulled on the edge of the loose brick. It slid out easily, just as it always had. Behind it, nestled in the dark cavity, was the small oilcloth wrapped package. I unwrapped it. The brass key was cool and heavy in my palm. It felt like a scepter, the key to the past, and the key to the future. I didn't put it back. I slipped it into my pocket. Then I went to the phone. I looked up the number for a real estate agent, one who specialized in selling older historic homes. I made an appointment for the following week. My children thought they had put my life in a box. They had no idea I was about to put their entire world in one. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself one last time, feeling the lie of it on my tongue. It was about teaching a lesson in value, a lesson in respect. A lesson their father had tried to build into his legacy, a lesson they had failed to learn. Class was now in session, and I was the only teacher. My first move was silence, complete and total silence. It was the most powerful weapon in my arsenal, and the one they were least equipped to handle. My children thrived on noise, the pings of their smartphones, the chatter of their social circles, the constant validation of their choices. Silence to them was a void, an error message. I bought a cheap prepaid phone, a simple flip phone, with a new number. I gave the number to only 2 people, Margaret and my lawyer, Miss Davies. Then I turned off the landline ringer in my house, and let my old cell phone's battery die. I let the digital world they dominated go dark. For the first few days, nothing happened. I imagined them being busy, self-satisfied, telling their friends about the wonderful selfless thing they'd done for their poor, aging mother. But then, the predictable rhythm of their demands began to falter. Charlotte was the first to notice. She was used to calling me every other day for a 5-minute surface-level chat that was more of a check-in on her to-do list than a real conversation. The calls to my cell phone went straight to voicemail. The calls to the house went unanswered. Margaret, my loyal informant, checked my old voicemail for me. The first message was just Charlotte. "Hey Mom, just calling to see how you're liking the house. It must be so much easier to clean. Call me back." The next one, a day later, had a slight edge of annoyance. "Mom, I've called a couple of times. I know this is a big change, but you could at least pick up the phone. I hope you're not still sulking." Then Ethan started. His messages were more direct. Mom, Charlotte says you're not answering. Your voicemail is full, call me. We need to discuss the quarterly property tax bill on the lake cottage. Ah, the lake cottage. One of the properties whose deed was sitting in the safe deposit box. A property they used for lavish weekend parties, assuming it was just part of the family portfolio they'd one day inherit. They had no idea that its ownership was tied directly to the clutter they'd so cavalierly dismissed. I did nothing. I let the silence stretch. I started packing my own things, the few items they had left behind. My clothes, my toiletries, the food in my pantry. I hired a small independent moving company, two strong, quiet men who asked no questions. I was methodically and silently dismantling my life on Chestnut Street, but on my own terms this time. The real estate agent, a kind woman named Sarah, had come by. She'd walked through the empty rooms, and her eyes had lit up. The bones on this house are incredible, she'd said. Original hardwood, crown molding. Once we get some modern staged furniture in here, it'll sell in a week. Staged furniture. The irony was delicious. My children had emptied my home of its soul to make it better, and now a stranger was going to fill it with fake soulless furniture to make it more appealing to other strangers. The panic from Ethan and Charlotte began to escalate in the second week. The tone of the voicemails shifted from annoyed to worried, and then to accusatory. This from Ethan, Mom. This isn't funny anymore. I drove by the house, and your car is in the driveway, but you're not answering the door. What is going on? If you're trying to punish us, it's incredibly childish. And from Charlotte, is this about the storage unit? Are you really going to be this dramatic? We were trying to help you. Some friend of yours, a Margaret, called me and asked if I was proud of myself. Who does she think she is? You need to call me right now. The first concrete consequence of their actions, the first domino I had quietly tipped over, was a small, seemingly insignificant bill. For years, I had kept the internet and cable bill for Ethan's downtown apartment in my name. It was a legacy from when he first moved out after college, a bit of help I'd offered that had just never ended. He was a high-earning financial analyst. He could more than afford it, but he'd never bothered to change it, and I'd never bothered to make him. It was part of the pattern of my quiet, invisible support. 2 weeks prior, I had called the provider and canceled the service. The call came on a Tuesday night. I didn't answer, of course, but Margaret relayed the voicemail to me later that evening. It was Ethan, and his voice was tight with fury. Mom, why is my internet off? I called the company, and they said the account holder canceled the service. Did you do this? I have a market analysis report due tomorrow that I have to upload. I'm at a coffee shop right now, like a college student. What the hell is going on? Call me back. Immediately, I sat in my nearly empty house and allowed myself a small bitter smile. He wasn't angry that I had been paying his bill for a decade. He was angry that I had stopped. His convenience, his entitlement, was the natural order of the universe. My paying for it was an invisible, assumed fact. My not paying for it was a hostile act. The real panic, however, started at the end of the month. It began with their trust funds. Arthur had set them up so that they each received a monthly allowance, a stipend drawn from investment dividends, that was managed by our family's financial advisor, a man named Mr. Henderson. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough to cover their car payments and other vanities. It was a little something extra that they had both come to rely on, a cushion that made their comfortable lives even more so. The disbursement required my signature every month, a simple formality, they thought. On the 28th of the month, Mr. Henderson called my old number, as expected. His message was polite and professional. Clara, just calling for your sign-off on the monthly distribution for Ethan and Charlotte. Please give my office a call at your earliest convenience. I didn't call. The first of the month came and went. The money did not appear in their bank accounts. This was not like the internet bill. This was a direct hit to their finances, a disruption to the steady flow of money they had taken for granted their entire adult lives. The ensuing voicemail barrage was epic. Ethan, Mom, where is the distribution? It didn't come through. I called Henderson's office, and they said they're waiting for your authorization. What are you doing? This is my money. You are legally obligated to sign that. Charlotte, I can't believe you. You're holding our money hostage because you're mad about some old furniture. My club membership payment bounced. Mom, do you have any idea how embarrassing that is? You are being cruel and vindictive. Dad would be so ashamed of you. That one stung, but the sting was distant now. It was like an old wound that had scarred over, tough and insensitive. They still thought this was about furniture. They still didn't understand the fundamental nature of their crime. They had treated my memories, my history, and their father's legacy as worthless, and now the part of that legacy they actually did value, the cold, hard cash, was being withheld. The connection was right in front of their faces, but their arrogance was a blindfold. I knew Ethan's claim about my legal obligation was a bluff. He was a financial analyst, not a lawyer. He was used to bullying his way through things with aggressive confidence. He had no idea about the codicil. He had never seen the will. He assumed, like most people, that an inheritance was a simple automatic transaction. He had no concept of the brilliant, cautious trap his father had laid for him. The house on Chestnut Street sold in 4 days. The new owners were a young family, a doctor and a teacher with 2 small children. They loved the old-world charm, the big backyard, the solid brick construction. They wanted to fill it with life again. I met them briefly during the closing. They were kind and excited. They talked about planting a garden and building a treehouse. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was a gentle one. The house deserved a new story. My story there was over. The children had seen to that. The proceeds from the sale went directly into a new bank account at a new bank, an account to which my children had no links and no knowledge. I used a portion of it to rent a small, beautiful apartment in a quiet building on the other side of town, near Margaret. It had a balcony that overlooked a park, and the afternoon sun streamed into the living room. It was small, but it was mine. I began to fill it, not with things, but with peace. The sale of the house was the silent checkmate. They had no idea it was even on the market. They were so focused on the missing allowance and the insult of the cancelled internet that they hadn't thought to check on the largest physical asset of all. They still thought of it as Mom's house, a place they had so generously improved for me. The idea that I would simply sell it, that I would sever that final tie, was beyond their comprehension. They were about to find out. The silent takeover was complete. The loud, messy collapse was about to begin. The discovery that the house had been sold was not made by Ethan or Charlotte. It was made by a cousin, Brenda, who happened to be driving down Chestnut Street and saw the prominent sold sign on the lawn. Brenda was a notorious gossip, and the news spread through the extended family like wildfire. My old phone, which I had recharged out of a grim sense of curiosity, began to light up with texts and missed calls from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all asking the same bewildered question. Clara sold the house. This was the beginning of the great power shift. My children had always been adept at managing the family narrative. They were the successful ones, the ones with the impressive careers and the perfect families. I was the quiet, slightly dotty old mother they had to manage. They had undoubtedly been feeding the family a carefully curated story about my erratic behavior, my stubbornness, my refusal to accept their help. They were painting me as the villain, the ungrateful parent who was punishing them for trying to do the right thing. But the sale of the house was a fact too large and too public to be twisted. It was a clear, definitive action. It didn't look like the act of a confused, feeble old woman. It looked like the act of someone who was decisively and completely moving on. The family exodus began not as an exodus from me, but from them. Relatives who had initially offered them sympathy started asking pointed questions. Why would your mother sell the house she lived in for 45 years without telling you what really happened that weekend? Margaret, my loyal general, did her part. She didn't spread gossip, but when asked, she would say things like, "You should ask Ethan and Charlotte what they think the difference is between decluttering and desecration," or "Clara is a strong woman." She just realized her strength was being taken for granted. She planted seeds of doubt, and in the fertile ground of my children's arrogance, those seeds found purchase. The true desperation from my children began when they finally realized the house was gone. Ethan left a voicemail that was a masterpiece of panicked rage. "You sold the house? You sold Dee's house without even telling us? That house is our inheritance. It's part of our birthright. What were we going to do with it? That's not the point. You had no right. I'm calling a lawyer. You are mentally incompetent. We are going to have you declared unfit and take control of your assets for your own protection." It was an empty threat, and we both knew it. Miss Davies had already prepared me for this. Any attempt to have me declared incompetent would trigger a full psychiatric evaluation, one I would pass with flying colors. It would also trigger a legal discovery process, where their actions, the non-consensual clearing of my home, the financial dependency they tried to hide, would be laid bare for a court to see. Their attempt to seize control would only expose their own greed and manipulation. They were trapped. Their countermoves became increasingly frantic and clumsy. Charlotte, abandoning all pretense of concern, tried emotional blackmail. She sent me a long, rambling email, which found its way to my new secret email address via Margaret, who had been given my old login to monitor for just such an event. The email was a litany of accusations and self-pity. "I cannot believe what you are doing to us, to your own children. After all we have done for you, we tried to give you a beautiful, clean home, and you repay us by selling it and cutting us off. My friends are asking me what's wrong. My husband thinks our family is a mess. You're ruining my life because you're mad about some old junk. And now I find out that the trust distribution is being held up. This isn't just about my club membership anymore, Mother. The down payment for our new house in the Hamptons is due in 2 months. We were counting on liquidating some of the trust assets for that. You know this. We talked about it at Easter. You are deliberately sabotaging my family's happiness." I read the email and felt a profound, chilling sadness. She didn't see the connection. She saw the trust fund as a resource to be tapped for a house in the Hamptons, and my memories as junk to be cleared out. She couldn't grasp that in the world Arthur and I had built, the two were inextricably linked. The respect for one was the prerequisite for the other. Their final, most desperate move was to try and get the key themselves. They went to the bank, the old First National. They probably walked in, dripping with entitlement, and demanded access to Clara Peterson's safe deposit box. They would have presented their IDs, explained that I was their mother, that I was unwell, and that they were the beneficiaries. The bank, of course, would have politely but firmly refused them. A safe deposit box is a private contract. Only the key holder or their legally appointed agent can gain access. Without the key, and without being named on the contract, they were just two strangers asking to open a locked box. They had hit a literal and figurative wall of steel. The family, meanwhile, had almost entirely sided with me. The story of the surprise home cleanout had become a cautionary tale whispered at family gatherings. Ethan's arrogance and Charlotte's entitlement, once seen as signs of success, were now viewed as character flaws. They found themselves isolated, their calls unreturned, their invitations politely declined. They had misjudged the situation so completely. They thought the family's loyalty was to their success, to their money. They never realized that for a family, the true currency is memory, history, and respect for one's elders. They had proven themselves bankrupt on all 3 counts, and now they were being ostracized for it. They had locked themselves not just out of their inheritance but out of their own family. The confrontation, when it finally came, was exactly what I had expected. desperate, messy, and entirely on my terms. They must have been truly at the end of their rope to do what they did next. They hired a private investigator to find me. It took him less than a week. My life wasn't a secret, just private. One evening, there was a knock on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw them standing there, Ethan and Charlotte, looking haggard and furious. I opened the door, but kept the security chain engaged. They stood in the hallway, framed by the generic beige paint of the building. They looked so out of place in my new quiet world. "Mother," Ethan bit out, his face pale with stress. "Let us in, we need to talk." "I believe we're done talking," I said, my voice calm. I was surprised at how steady it was. There was no fear, no anger, just a quiet finality. "Don't be ridiculous," Charlotte snapped, her voice high and strained. "We know what you've done. You sold the house, you cut off our funds. Now you're going to give us the key." "The key?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Don't play dumb." Ethan's voice rose, and a neighbor peeked her head out of her door down the hall before quickly retreating. "The key to the safe deposit box. We went to the bank. They wouldn't let us in. They said we need the key." "Dad's key." "Ah, that key," I said, my hand instinctively going to my pocket, where it now lived. The key that was hidden in the fireplace, behind a loose brick, in the house you so kindly decluttered for me. For the first time, a flicker of understanding, of true dawning horror, crossed their faces. They had thought the key was just a missing object, something I had misplaced or was deliberately hiding. They had not connected its location to their actions. The blindfold was finally coming off. "What does that have to do with anything?" Charlotte asked, but her voice lacked conviction. "It has everything to do with everything," I said, and my voice was as cold and hard as the bank vault door. "That key, your father, a man you claim to know so well, hid it in the heart of our home. He wrapped it in cloth and tucked it away behind a brick, surrounded by 40 years of soot and memory. To him, it was a symbol. The key to your future was physically embedded in the foundations of your past. He told me he wanted to be sure you were mature enough to understand that connection before you got your hands on the money." I paused, letting the words sink in. "And what did you do?" "You came into that house, and you declared its contents, its memories, its very soul, to be worthless junk. You called his letters, his books, his entire life, clutter. You didn't just clean out a house, you failed the single most important test your father ever set for you. You proved in one weekend that you lacked the one thing he demanded: respect for your own legacy." Ethan stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. All the bluster, all the arrogant certainty, had drained away, leaving behind a hollow-eyed man I barely recognized. We didn't know," he stammered. "We were just trying to help. You were trying to manage me." I corrected him. "You were trying to tidy me up and put me on a shelf until you needed something. You didn't see a person. You saw a problem to be solved, an estate to be settled. You saw a collection of assets, not a life. So what now?" Charlotte's voice was a whisper. "Are you just going to keep it all? Ruin our lives over some stuff?" "This was never about the money," I said, and for the first time it was the absolute truth. The revenge had been satisfying, but this moment, this forced education, was the real point. It was about value. "You took things from me that are priceless, photo albums I can never replace, letters from your father that were my last physical connection to his voice, my mother's ring, thrown in a box with old batteries. You cannot put a price on those things. So I have taken from you the things you value most. It seems a fair exchange." I looked from my son's panicked face to my daughter's tear-streaked one. There was no triumph in me, only a vast, empty sadness for what they had become. "The trust your father left you are not gone," I told them, my voice softening slightly. "They are secure, and they will remain secure, under my discretionary control, as per the terms of his will. Perhaps one day, you will demonstrate the maturity he required, But that day is not today, and it will not be tomorrow. What do you want from us? Ethan pleaded. An apology. Fine, we're sorry we moved your things. I almost laughed. It was so small, so inadequate. An apology is a start, Ethan, but it's not a key. You don't get to burn down a forest and then say you're sorry and expect all the trees to magically grow back. You need to understand what you destroyed, and that is a lesson that will take a very, very long time to learn. I looked at them one last time, these two strangers who wore my children's faces. Go home, I said. Go back to your lives. Live with the consequences of your choices. That is your inheritance, for now. And with that, I closed the door, sliding the chain back into its lock. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, listening to their footsteps fade away down the hall. It was over. The war was won, but it felt less like a victory and more like a necessary, painful amputation. I had cut them off to save myself, and in the silence of my new home, for the first time in a very long time, I finally felt safe. It's been a year now since I closed that door, a year of quiet, of peace, of rediscovery. I did go back to the storage unit, but only once. I hired a professional archivist, a gentle woman who understood the sanctity of memory. Together we went through every box. We organized, we sorted, we photographed, we separated the treasures from the true trash. Arthur's letters and the family photos are now with me, in my new apartment, housed in beautiful archival quality albums and boxes. The rest of it, the furniture, the knickknacks, the stuff, I let it go. I held a massive estate sale and donated every last penny to the charitable trust I established in Arthur's name. The old porcelain shepherdess my grandmother carried across an ocean now sits on the mantle of a young immigrant family who bought it for $1. I like to think my grandmother would approve. My life is smaller now, but it feels so much bigger. I have breakfast on my balcony every morning. I've taken up painting, something I always wanted to do. Margaret and I are planning a trip to Italy next spring to see all the art and drink wine in the sunshine. We're using a little of the interest from my own savings, the funds Arthur and I had earmarked for adventures. It seems the right time for an adventure. I am living, not just existing. I am building a new life from the foundations of the old, but this time, the blueprints are my own. My children, they are a different story. The consequences I promised them arrived, right on schedule. Without the trust fund stipend and the casual financial cushion I had always provided, their lives began to fray at the edges. Charlotte's husband, it turned out, was not as wealthy as he appeared. His development business was heavily leveraged, and without the expected injection of cash from Charlotte's trust, they had to pull out of the Hamptons house deal. I heard through the family grapevine that their marriage is under immense strain. Appearances, it seems, are expensive to maintain. Ethan's fall was less dramatic, but more profound. Losing the house he saw as his birthright, and the steady income he saw as his due, forced him to reevaluate his entire life. He lost a major client because of the internet fiasco, and his reputation at his firm took a hit. He had to sell his flashy car and move to a smaller, more affordable apartment. For the first time in his life, he had to live within his means. A few months ago, I received a letter from him. It wasn't an email or a text. It was a real handwritten letter on simple paper. It was long, rambling, and full of a pain that was raw and genuine. He didn't ask for money. He didn't demand the key. He just apologized. Not just for the house, but for years of taking me for granted, for seeing me as a utility rather than a person. He wrote about his father, and about how he was beginning to understand what Dad had meant about value. He wrote, "You didn't take our future from us, you forced us to finally earn it." It was the beginning of a conversation. Not a reconciliation, not yet, but a beginning. I have not written back. It is not yet time. Charlotte has not contacted me. I suspect her pride is a fortress too high to surrender. Perhaps it always will be. So, here I am, in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the few things that truly matter. The key to the safe deposit box sits in a small, carved wooden box on my bookshelf, next to a photo of Arthur and me on our wedding day. It's no longer a weapon, it's just a key. A reminder that true wealth isn't something you can store in a vault. It's stored in here, in your heart, and in here, in your head. It's the memories you make, the love you share, and the respect you earn. My children thought my memories were clutter. They thought my love was unconditional. They learned that love, true love, is not a doormat, it's a garden. It needs to be tended, watered, and respected. If you treat it like a weed-choked lot, don't be surprised when you find yourself locked outside the gate. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it gave you something to think about. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know, and I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment where you had to teach someone the difference between price and value? What do you think I should do about Ethan's letter? I truly value your perspective. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and take care of your memories. They're more precious than you think.